The Porsche Sport Podcast, powered by Porsche Center Leeds. Test drive the new Porsche Taycan and experience soul electrified.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The podcast will start.
The Porsche Sport Podcast, the only weekly podcast to bring you all the latest Porsche motorsport news and opinions. The Porsche Mobile One Super Cup, World Endurance Series, Le Mans 24 Hours, the IMSA WeatherTech Championship, Porsche Carrera Cup, the 24-Hour Series, SRO Championships, esports, and exclusive interviews. Make sure to subscribe on your chosen podcast platform. For more information and exclusive news, visit PorscheSport.com.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Porsche Sport Podcast, because I am privileged to say we are joined by endurance racing and Porsche racing royalty, Hurley Haywood. Now, Hurley, at this point in the programme, I would normally read out the achievements of our guests, but for you, it's going to take too long. We're going to be here all day. So we're, what for me, the greatest endurance racer of all time. It is such an honour to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on to join us.
It's my pleasure.
Now, you're known as a Porsche legend. A lot of your success was with Porsche, but I'm the closet Corvette fan on the Porsche Sport Podcast. And a lot of what people might not know is that your racing actually started off with a Corvette, with a Corvette brought from Mickey Chevrolet in Chicago. Now, I want to ask you about this car and how on earth you convinced your mother that it was a good idea to buy such a car.
That's a simple answer. I waited till my father was out of town, and I took her to look at a car. I told the salesman, "Don't start it; it'll, scare her." So she looked at it. She said, "Oh, that looks just like you." So that's how I got the Corvette. And then when I went to college down in Florida and used to race all the time in autocrosses, I was pretty unbeatable. And one weekend, Peter Gregg showed up with his transporter with his race car in it that he was wanted to test something before he went to Lime Rock. And we had a runoff and I beat him. And so he came over and introduced himself. He said, you must be pretty good to beat me. And that's how the relationship started.
Of course, this car at that point in time, I believe Mickey Chevrolet were renowned for selling fast cars and really quite exotic cars. Was there anything particular about this Corvette that made it so good at autocrossing, which for our European listeners is kind of like how would you describe it? It's kind of like going around cones in a car park, for lack of a better expression, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's where the courses were set up. They were set up where I met Peter was at a Winn-Dixie, which is a grocery chain here in Florida, and they basically had this little course laid out with pylons, and it was not the ideal place to have a 500 horsepower Corvette, but it was enough to beat Peter. So that's how that whole thing started. And then he instantly got me involved with Porsche. He said, get rid of the Corvette. We'll get a Porsche. And then we went and 1969, he got a really beautiful prepared factory race car. And we won the first race that we were in, which was a world championship race in Watkins Glen. I had really one race under my belt at that time. So I, was not qualified with the FIA to get a license, but he said, "Don't worry about it. We'll get you one through NASCAR." And I sent in my $20 and got a bona fide license. Then I applied to the FIA with a NASCAR license. They granted me that license, and then I went on. And Peter and I raced at Watkins Glen, and we won. And I was, sitting on cloud nine, man. I was on top of the world. And then I got that dreaded letter from the military, and that this race was in June. In October, I was on the way to Vietnam. So
we will come on to Vietnam. I mean, that's an extraordinary part of the story. I mean, they come on, but staying on the subject of persuasion. Now, getting the 911, the Corvette was mum's consent, as I know this from convincing my mum to let me do silly things with cars. The fathers are a different story. The Porsche from Peter Gregg, that required a bit of convincing to dad as well, I understand.
Well, when I was in college, I was a business administration major, and I came up with this really slick proposal. It gave him, actually, if I was being successful, I would pay him back all the money that he lent me. He made, though, a caveat to it, and it said, you must be successful enough to continue after 2 years on your own. You can't drop down. You have to remain at this level or above. And I agreed to that. And thank heaven, everything lined up on my, I won 2 championships, 71 and 72. And then in 73, I was in, won Daytona and Sebring, and then was in the Can-Am series with a 917. And that sort of, got my name in the spotlight, and I was able to continue on and paid him back all the money.
I was going to say that's probably a good definition of succeeding in that time frame that was given as well, by any measure.
I never thought that I would be able to do that, but Peter, it was the best GT team in the nation, and Peter was a wonderful mentor to me, and he really taught me what to think about, how to prepare yourself for racing, and his team was the best. So I really had not only a great mentor, but a great team behind me.
Mm-hmm. And of course, going from an autocross in a grocery supermarket car park to the Watkins Glen 6 hours, I mean, one of the biggest endurance races in the world. I mean, what was it like there, being all of a sudden going from that one relatively, amateur level to a full professional level, and you've got V12 Matras going flying past you, and you're in your 911. I mean, how did you adapt so quickly to that?
Well, it's just, something that is kind of a natural born talent, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How you prepare for the race mentally. And as you said, I was in a race where these guys were my heroes, these
mm-hmm.
guys I was racing against. And I could have been totally intimidated by those people. And when you see these, 917s and Matras going by you at a tremendous difference to speed, you just kind of, oh man, what am I doing out here? It is, but it all kind of worked out. We ran according to plan and won the GT portion, beat all the Corian fiberglass Corvettes, and it was really cool deal.
And was in those early times, obviously Peter spotted something in you very early, but did he express his surprise or his appreciation or anything of that time? What were his kind of reactions as you were making such rapid progress in such a short space of time? I mean, what were his reactions when you got to Watkins Glen and you were doing so well?
Well, I think, basically he saw something at that autocross that
mm-hmm.
impressed him. And then when we got the race car, we went up to Savannah, Rolling Road in Savannah. And we had 2 full days of testing and practicing. And that's where he made the decision, this guy's got what it takes to be a racing driver. And you can teach really anybody how to drive a really fast lap in a race car. But you can't teach somebody how to be a race car driver. It's like chess. Your moves are dictated, 3 steps in front of where you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he saw that. He and I had similar backgrounds, and we both started in Corvettes, and I just think he saw that was going to be a good match, and turned out to be perfect.
Well, that certainly was. I mean, and of course, after that, like you said, on cloud nine, winning Watkins Glen, and then as many young Americans had at that time, the dreaded letter through the door to call to Vietnam War. I mean, what was your kind of initial reaction? What did you feel like you were leaving racing behind for good at that point, or what were your kind of thoughts at that point? Because I couldn't imagine what that was like with racing career or not any racing career to be asked to do that.
Well, to be honest, I mean, when you go over to a war zone, you don't know if you're going to come back or not, and the thought of racing and the thought of getting back into the saddle was what kept me motivated and kept my mind off of all the stuff you could get bogged down with. So I was an airfield commander's aide. Our offices were in the control tower, and I got to drive him around in a Jeep, and basically was out of the direct fighting. We did have several instances where they bombs were coming into the camp, but I was relatively safe. But it still is an eye opener of war and what it takes to be successful in a war. And one of the things that I learned in the military was how to take orders and not to question the orders. And I think from the racing standpoint that benefited me by doing exactly what I was told to do, no more nor less. And that was, I think, one of the reasons why Peter was, comfortable with that. He was in the military and in the Navy. And I think that, he and I both sort of was on the same wavelength.
And from what I've read about Peter, obviously, I mean, one right up there with yourself is one of the greatest endurance racers ever. And today, people would see him as a gentleman driver or an owner driver or whatever terminology you want to use. But from what I understand about him, he demanded perfection. There was nothing less than perfection would do. I mean, was that something that you think was instilled from his military days, and was that something where that, I suppose, commonality that you had was quite helpful in how that gelled when you got back in 71 and started winning straight away?
Well, Peter's nickname was Peter Perfect. Everything had to be absolutely perfect. The team, the look of the team, the cars, the drivers. We could not afford to make any mistakes of any kind. And I think that philosophy really adhered to the recipe to be successful on a racing team. When you make a mistake, even back then, where we would win races by miles, not by seconds, like today, you just could not afford to make mistakes. And if you made a mistake, the chances of catching up were slim. Now, if you make a mistake, it's almost impossible to catch up, because there's so many cars that are so equal in their performance, driven by really good teams, that it's not mechanical failures that take people out, it's driver error. It's you just can't afford to make a mistake from the driver's standpoint. So it really puts a lot of pressure on the drivers to go fast and not make any mistakes.
And of course, we were talking about that before we came on the show. I mean, Porsche's experience this year, or the WeatherTech Porsche team at Daytona this year, it was unfortunately, it was kind of another driver's mistake which put them out, and they still had to drive just as hard, but no matter what they did, they couldn't, like exactly what you said, they couldn't close that gap down no matter how fast they drove.
Yeah, I mean, it was just unfortunate. The WeatherTech car was an RSR from I think it was a new one, and that was a big learning curve for that team. That car's got its own sort of way of being handled, and they did a good job. But you never can predict what's going to happen. And when something does happen, your team has to have the ability to fix it right then and there. And I don't know really what went wrong and what put them out, but those are just part of racing. You just have to, when you do have an incident, you have to have all the resources right then to able to fix the problem. Bumpers, whatever the problem, whatever got damaged, had to be fixed quickly, or you're just never gonna, catch up again.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I remember speaking to Andy Lally, who'd been racing at Petit Le Mans the year that my fellow Scotsman Alan McNish crashed on the parade lap, and he says, "I've never seen mechanics put a car back together so quickly. The Audi guys, the factory guys at that time, just jumped on and had the whole car, back and running again." I mean, let's go forward to when you get back from Vietnam. It's back to being a racing driver again. I mean, those early days in IMSA, the first ever IMSA GT race in the little 914, and you're racing against the massive Corvettes at VIR, a circuit which is now state of the art, but at the time it wasn't what it is today. The circuit at VIR.
You can say that again. It was like racing in somebody's junkyard back then, and it was good. I mean, we were up against Corvettes and Camaros and Mustangs. And we knew that we weren't going to be able to match those guys with lap time speed, but we could, but at the halfway point, we were still strong and they were fading, and we just push, made them, use up their brakes, use up their tires, and we won that way. We won just by being smart, and really with the 914. That's what you had to be. And even with the 911 back then, we won a lot of races with 911s by just being smarter than the opposition. We certainly did not have the pace of the Corvettes or the Camaros, but we had the longevity and we had the reliability. So those two things really, really helped us with the Porsches by winning so much.
And from a marketing perspective, I understand that the 914 at that point, it was very important to Porsche, with it being a new model, to go and race with it. I mean, with obviously Brumos being a dealer, how important was it to prove that this little car, this little 914, could go and take on these massive Corvettes and Mustangs? I mean, what was the kind of feeling at the time from the public? Did they get anything from that competition success of this little car?
Well, that whole program was put together by Joe Hoppen, and Joe was very instrumental in the racing programs for Porsche and Audi at that time, and they wanted that 914 to be successful, and they thought that by racing it in IMSA, they could prove that it was a giant killer, and that's basically that's what we were up against. We were up against some major teams with major money behind them that had twice as much horsepower than we did. Body work, aerodynamic stuff, where the 914 was just a beautifully clean car. It was just it had a good engine, had a powerful engine, didn't have a lot of drag on the body with aerodynamic drag, and it was very nimble. It was just a lot of fun to drive it with. That was the first Porsche that was basically, well, not the first Porsche, the 356s, 356, and the 550 had mid-engine, but that was the same concept. And it was just, we could out-handle, out-brake. We couldn't out-drag somebody down the straightaway, but we could catch him by the second corner.
Wow. So it's almost like a little bit like a sort of Lotus Elan kind of theory as well, though Lotus had it in the front with that sort of little diminutive sports car. Fantastic. In those, of course, everybody knows Brumos is the white car with the blue and red stripe with the 59, but a few of those early cars were painted a kind of dark or red-orange color. Why was that?
That was because Dr. Porsche's favorite color was orange.
Right. Okay.
And so, as Peter wanted to honor Professor Porsche, and that's why our cars were painted orange.
Oh, okay.
But somebody that was very artistic pointed out to Bob Snodgrass, who was in the mix at that time, that a orange car just did not photograph well on a black and white photo. The contrast was not there. So we were an American team. So Bob Snodgrass and a bunch of people came up with the design of the Brumos stripe, and that we have had that paint job since 1971 or 1973, and it's one of the most iconic paint schemes on a race car worldwide. Everybody, you don't have to read what's on the side of the car. You just see that paint scheme, and people know that's a Brumos car.
It is. It's both myself and Luke. We do quite a lot of simulator racing, and you wouldn't believe the amount of people that when you race online, people from all over the world, and the amount of Porsches with the Brumos livery on all kinds is fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. I mean, let's talk about, you've had 5 wins at Daytona, as many as any other driver in history. I mean, 1973 was an interesting one because the rules were changing. The 917 had kind of been killed off, and Porsche had this little, well, what was then classed as a prototype, but it was a 911, but with a few bits added onto it. And there was a car for you and Peter, and a car for Roger Penske and his guys. Now, and also a young Norbert Singer was sent over from Porsche. Tell us about that experience where, from what I understand, you guys were, everyone expected Penske to be the star, but you guys gave them a bit of a shock. Tell us about that event.
Yeah, it was really funny because Peter didn't get the name Peter Perfect for nothing. So when when we received the car, we disassembled everything, checked the motors, checked everything, and our mechanics found that the flywheel bolts were loose. So Peter immediately called up Roger and said, we found that the flywheel bolts on our cars were loose, and you should check it. And Roger just thought he was, messing with him and didn't check it. And that's what took him out. But it was wonderful for me to be able to learn from those guys. Roger Penske running a team, Mark Donohue and George Fulmer were driving.
Mm-hmm.
So it was Peter and myself against George and Mark. And I remember many times both following George and following Mark, where I really learned a lot about defensive driving and how you set up the competition to make the move on somebody with the least amount of jeopardy, least amount of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember George Fulmer was in the car, and I was just right on his bumper, and he deliberately ran me off the track. He went off the track too, but he wanted to see, is Hurley going to follow me? Sure enough, he went off the racetrack. I went off the racetrack. So I was not going to let him get 1 foot away from me. So, but it was a great experience. And really, when you look at the races, winning that race and then winning Sebring were the 2 events that really put my name up in the lights. And that would have never happened without Porsche and without Peter.
And of course, this was very, very early on in Norbert Singer's time at Porsche. He'd only been there for a couple of years at that point. And I read recently that when he arrived there, the Penske guys were maybe a little bit, they weren't really kind of that receptive of him. But once the Penske car went out, he came down to your pit and actually was he was given a bit more of a warm welcome at Brumos. Is that true?
That's very true.
Mm-hmm.
Now you got to remember though that Norbert Singer and Mr. Flegel
mm-hmm.
were very heavily involved with the development of the 917.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So Mark was running the 917-10 in Can-Am in 72, and then I got the chance to drive the 917-10 in 73. And then Mark went on to drive the 917-30, which was like night and day between those two cars. But you got to remember when everybody says in reference to the 73 cars that it was an RSR, but it really was classified as an RS, as a ducktail. The underpinnings of the cars were all RSR, suspension, brakes, all that kind of stuff. And Porsche really wanted to test those components to make sure that everything was going to work well when the car made its transition into the RSR. So those cars that we had at Daytona and Sebring were RSs. They weren't RSRs. They were RS. But then after Sebring was finished, then the nomenclature changed to an RSR, 911 RSR. But all the underpinnings we had for both Sebring and Daytona.
Well, it's funny. I just read in an article about that particular time, Hurley, and I must have read 5 different pieces calling it an RS and 5 different calling it an RSR. So I'm glad you've cleared that one up for me as well.
The body work was an RS. The internal parts of the car were RSR, but actually those cars were classified as RSs because homologation had not transpired yet, so they really couldn't call it an RSR because it was not homologated. And this ran as a prototype at Daytona. So that's how it sort of got by the rules as a running prototype.
Typical Porsche getting around the rules whenever they can. I mean, let's talk about Can-Am, Hurley, because for me, this is one of the most incredible periods of motor racing history, I think. I mean, you're part of a very exclusive club of people who ever got to drive one of the Porsche 917-10s. And I'm reading actually Mark Donoghue's book at the moment from when he retired. And the story is about developing the car. I mean, just tell us about how you acquired the car and your experiences of driving it, because these cars probably the most outrageous racing cars ever made.
Well, Peter in 1972 decided that he wanted to race in the Can-Am. So he went over. The first rendition of that car was a normally aspirated car. So it had fairly streamlined bodywork, didn't have all the big aerodynamic aids on the car. And Peter really was not comfortable driving an open wheel car and then also driving a car that had that much power. But he very quickly realized that he was not going to be competitive unless he changed to a 917-10, which involved the turbocharged motor. And then when he sent the car back, the car was converted over to the 917-10 specs. He got it back, and it just frightened him to death to drive the car. And he had a couple, pretty major crashes with the car. And then he looked at me and he said, "How would you like to try it?" So I said, "Absolutely." And that's how I really kind of got the tip to drive the 917. And it was Mark Donoghue. If it hadn't been for Mark Donoghue, because Peter really was not helpful in trying to understand the nuances of driving a 917-10. And Mark Donoghue, however, really came to my rescue. I think he just felt pity for me. And he and I had become friends. And he really helped me, get my head around racing with the caliber of driver that was driving the Can-Am at that point. And also getting my head around the nuances of the driving a car that had, 1,000 horsepower, 1,000 plus horsepower. And he said, you take little steps. Don't take too big of a step because that's when you get in trouble. But if you take enough little steps, you'll get to where the big steps would end up. And that's a philosophy that I used, and it worked. I was third in the championship behind Donoghue and Fulmer, so it was good advice. And we were up against the best drivers in the world: Jody Scheckter, Brian Redmond, David Hobbs, all those guys were, intimidating to me. But, once you strap your helmet on and get in the driver's seat, everybody's equal.
Indeed they are. And of course, the context to that is, normally you would say, oh, third in the championship, so what? But at that time of all times, the 917 30s were the cars that Penske had were, like you say, were just like a spaceship, even compared to the car from the year before. I mean, some of the stories about Mark going over for almost months on end to Weissach to develop it, and stories of him and Helmut Flegel drinking bottles of cognac in the office and stuff, coming up with ideas. I mean, you must have gone over to Weissach a lot. Have you got any similar stories about drinking sessions with Porsche engineers trying to get the head around a problem?
Well, back then, going to Weissach and dealing with all the Porsche mechanics was really a family. It was a very, very close knit group of people that worked really fantastic together. And that was one of the reasons I believe that Porsche was so successful in those early days, because even the lowest person on the totem pole stood equal to the best person. And everybody felt that they were, an integral part of the team, that they were really contributing to the success. And that's why everybody really, really tried hard, regardless of what kind of racing they were doing, Can-Am racing or endurance racing. Everybody gave 100%. And many times, when we go over there, you were asked to stay in mechanics' homes. We had dinner with them. Basically, we lived with those guys. And it really created an atmosphere that was hard to beat. And that's why Porsche mechanics worked so incredibly hard with giving us the best equipment that we could possibly imagine, and came through all kinds of different circumstances and always, managed to get the car in perfect condition. So those guys are heroes to me, because we as drivers are the ones that always get the adulation, but it's the team that stands behind you that really should get the credit. We just drive.
Yeah, I know. I understand what you mean. I mean, do you think that such a culture? Well, first, two-part question. One, is there anywhere in modern motorsport where you see it existing like that anymore? And if not, is that even possible anymore to have that kind of atmosphere, if you like, with integrating the whole team at the same level?
I think it's much more difficult now because the teams are, have so much money involved in their programs. Basically, all of the team members and drivers are basically sequestered into a small area. They don't like you socializing. They really are restrictive, and that's because loose lips sink ships. So you don't want to have a driver talking to another driver and say, oh yeah, we had the same problem, we did this to fix it. And he's giving, not realizing, but he's giving really important information to the competition. So to solve that, everybody, pretty much stays into your own group. And when you go to these big, like Le Mans or Daytona, you see these giant motorhomes and catering for hundreds of people. And I mean, it's an amazing organization that's behind the pits, not what goes on in the pits, but what goes on outside of the pits. And basically, every driver has a certain menu that he likes to eat. The catering people, do that. I mean, it's amazing. I can't remember the year. I was writing a story for Automobile Magazine. Gene Jennings sent me over there to write behind the scenes kind of thing. And as a driver, you never think about all of that kind of stuff. You don't think where the food comes from. You don't think, yes, I have new tires, but where do those tires come from, and how do I know that it's the right compound? And when you're on the other side of the fence, looking at all that kind of stuff, it was just amazing to me of all that goes on behind the scenes that nobody really realizes. And it makes you really appreciate all the work that goes on behind the scenes that people don't even realize it's going on.
I think you're quite unique in that sense, Hurley, where you notice these things. I think there are some that maybe don't. I mean, I want to talk about. You mentioned a little bit about it with Peter phoning Roger up and talking about the flywheel bolts and stuff like that, which was, of course, wasn't one of his usual windups. But I understand Peter was quite good at windups with his competitors. What was your favorite memory of seeing Peter pull a fast one on his competitors? There must be a few.
Well, Peter absolutely was a master at intimidation, and the teams, and he was so good, and everybody wanted to know exactly what the setup was on Peter's car, and they would go by and copy it. So, the Porsche factory used to color code their springs, so you could have a red, white, red spring that was an 800-pound spring.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter devised a new color scheme. So if somebody came down and saw red, green, white, they would go, well, what the hell is that? And they would go by. So it was, and people would end up, they were very close to the actual color scheme that Porsche would use. But people would come down and they would look and they would see red, red, white, where the spring normally would be red, white, red. And red, white, red would be an 800-pound spring, where the other way would be, some outrageous 2,000-pound spring. So people would go out and the cars were undrivable. And, they would go back and they would come to me and they go, how the hell can you drive a car? I mean, how does that thing stay on the road? And I would smile and say, listen, just make sure you put the spring in a unit where you're able to get the exact spring right. And they soon caught on to what Peter was doing, but for several races there, it was pretty disastrous for the other teams.
I love it. It's the sort of thing you probably wouldn't get so much now. I guess there's these, like you say, with that secrecy, much more involved in the sport as well. I mean, you obviously, Harley, you're known around the world for driving with Porsche, but there have been little dalliances with a couple of other manufacturers. Of course, going to race with Jaguar because they thankfully had basically a 2-pedal car rather than a 3-pedal car after you had a bad injury. I mean, what was your takeaways from the kind of working practices of a company like Jaguar compared to a company like Porsche and the way they go about things? But my guess would be that they're quite different. But to tell me from what your feelings were at that point.
Well, they're very different, and the chance that I got to drive the Jaguar was really helpful for me, and with Porsche's permission, because they didn't want me sitting around, which turned out to be 2.5-year project to get my leg back in shape. And as you said, the Jaguars had a Hurley gearbox, which you didn't use the clutch to get in and out of the pits. And that was I was really took to that instantly. And you really, some people never get the hang of doing that with flipping the engine and using the gearbox, but I really enjoyed that. And we were, pretty competitive against the 962s at that point. Mm-hmm. And Bob Tullius actually called up Al Holbert and said, I'm looking for a driver for our team, and I know that Hurley's got some problems with his leg. What do you think? What do you think of Hurley, and do you think he would, fit well into the team? And Al said, if you can hire him right now. And so, that's how that whole thing started. Bob and I got along instantly. We were, I had heard really some horror stories about Bob. But he and I never really had a crossword. He's a great friend, and he had really good equipment. And there, I think that Tullius and Peter Gregg and Al Hobart were the ones that set the stage for that kind of preparation and the look of the car. Not only the car, but the way the team looked, the way the transfer looked, everything was really first class. And where Porsche was concerned with engineering, and they were the best in the world as far as engineering a race car.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, driver comfort, driver safety, that was something that was on the back burner. And you're driving these cars with 1,000 horsepower, like 935s, and the driver comfort was not part of the program with Porsche. Where with Jaguar, it was a little more reasonable sometimes. But when they saw, when you get dehydrated, when you're driving is 100%, you're sweating like a steam in a steam bath. The internal cockpit temperatures are 130, 140 degrees. You've got all the pipes from the oil coolers running through the cockpit. I mean, it is like being in a sauna. And once they figured out that keeping the drivers in good shape, where they could, operate at 100%, that was going to make them better. They were going to win more races. And, I brought my own doctor sometimes to the races, and he would give me an IV. Now at Le Mans, if you get an IV, you're out, no more. So they figured and that's why they now have, air-conditioned cockpits. They have sequential shifting. They have ABS brakes. They have all electronics that are governing the cars, which in reality, it's a whole different physical drain on the drivers. Yes, you are more comfortable in the cockpit. You don't have a lot of things that the old timers had to deal with, but the competition level is so intense. When you run a 24-hour race and you can have that many cars on the same lap within seconds of each other, that's a real testimony to the reliability of the cars, and two, the rules maker. Everybody wants the rules on their side, but they've done a fairly good job of getting that balance pretty accurately.
I completely agree with you. I mean, Daytona this year was a perfect example of that, not just in one class, but nearly every class. Every time there was a yellow flag, you had virtually the entire field bunched together and off they go for another kind of mass restart. I mean, many of you had two parts of your career, Hurley, where one, you were racing in all pro lineups for the works and what have you. But there was a lot of times where you would drive with an owner driver, which Peter was, of course, one of them, and many, many others. I mean, my question is now that in those days, somebody like an Al Holbert or a Peter Gregg, no allowances were made for them at all as amateur drivers or as the person paying for the effort, if you like. Nowadays, it's quite different. What are your thoughts on the kind of allowances that are made now to fit amateur drivers into the sport and the whole kind of topic of that?
Well, first, I would never classify Al Hobart and Peter Gregg as amateur drivers.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah.
They were as much professional as anybody else in the game, and they both owned the teams, but were sponsored by the factory, by the Porsche factory. So how that whole thing worked, and it worked really great for a great number of years, where the owners would have really professional teams with really good cars. They worked it out where the pros would start, they would run the middle, and the pros would finish. And all the owners got together and said, this is what we're going to do. Now, things happen during the race where that sequence gets a little bit out of whack, but it basically worked really great. And, Bruce Levin did it. All the guys, all the people that own teams, Rob Dyson,
Mhm.
Bob Aiken, all those people had a great time because they were equals to the pros.
Which made, as you say, made them a pro by default, if you like.
Right.
Yes. Uh-huh.
They would be racing against the pros.
Yep. Mhm.
Sometimes there were, huge differences in lap times, but it all kind of worked its way out. And in reality, that's what was the reason why guys like me were hired by these teams to
Yeah.
drive.
Mhm.
And it's what, basically our careers were made out of driving for these well-financed, well-developed teams that were owned by very rich, businessmen who did their part. They didn't think of it as amateur racing. They
Mhm.
were in pro racing.
Mhm.
Everybody was treated as a pro, but they knew they weren't going to be equal to the pros.
Mhm.
So in knowing that, all of the, the owners would all race together at the same time slot. So they were all very competitive with each other. So you had the pros against each other and you had the amateurs against each other. And it all kind of worked out perfectly. And that's the way it was and still is to this day.
Mhm.
When we look at the rules with sort of the Le Mans GT stuff sort of
Mhm.
fading into the background, now they're going to go to GTD Pro.
Mhm.
So you're going to get these really professional drivers coming in to drive, and there'll be the cars will look the same, but there'll be two distinctly different groups. So they'll have the GT AM and GT Pro.
Mhm.
And, that's a good idea, I guess. I mean, I always, if you're racing in a professional series, whether you're a team owner or not,
Mhm.
you're a pro.
Yep. I agree.
And
Yeah.
I think the guys that own the teams like to think of themselves as pros. They don't
Mhm.
like to think of themselves as amateurs.
Mhm.
So I think that the what you call somebody
Mhm.
is important in racing. You don't
Mhm.
want to call somebody that's spending millions of dollars an amateur. You
No.
know, he's a dedicated racer. He's does all the stuff. He tries to get better, but come on, a lot of these guys are middle-aged guys racing against kids, and
Yeah.
the kids are going to be quicker. It's just a fact.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, sometimes when I think about professional, I would think a professional is someone who's being paid a salary, whereas amateur has other connotations to it, doesn't it? As you rightly say, it's nobody racing in GTD and IMSA 25 cars. There's nothing amateur about that, is there? And you say the sums of money involved, absolutely incredible. I mean, talking of pro drivers, obviously you were still are a huge ambassador for Porsche in North America, which is such a important market for Porsche. Patrick Long has been with the factory for such a long time now, nearly 20 years, and in my mind does a great job both on and off track. I mean, is there an emerging person to come up and follow behind Patrick in the driver's seat, or if not, where will they come from, do you think, for Porsche's next American star? Because to me, it seems very important to make sure you've got an American driver racing in a Porsche at all times, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Bob Carlson, who used to be head of the PR department at Porsche, we were arranging a winter camp for all of the drivers, all the factory drivers.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob Snodgrass set that up where we're going to do it in Ponte Vedra. And they have a beach and they have all the training equipment there. And we had arranged for a big team dinner. So all the factory drivers were there. And Bob Snodgrass made sure that Patrick Long was sitting next to me.
Mm-hmm.
So we sat down, I shook his hand. I said, welcome. And I've been following you. You're really doing great. Just keep it up. And he said, well, what can you give me some advice to do? And I looked at him and I kind of smiled. I said, my advice to you is drive as fast as you can and keep your mouth shut. And to this day, Patrick said, that's the best advice anybody gave me. Because Porsche doesn't like to be, the engineers don't like to be told how to set the car up. They do it their way. It's our job as drivers to say, yeah, that works. And in a very articulate way, say, this is what the car is doing. But don't try to tell me how to engineer the car. If I do something wrong, tell me and we'll fix it. And basically, Patrick has done that, and he's a great, as you said, he's a great ambassador to Porsche. He and I are doing a thing next month at the Road Scholars up in Atlanta. And so, but to answer your question, we have a lot of talent out there that's young guys driving. We do a program, the junior program, where we look and train up and coming drivers. We do it at Barber. We didn't do it this year because of COVID and everything, but we'll reinitiate that program. But there's a lot of kids out there that are really talented, that are, when I look at where I was at that stage, they're light years ahead of where I was. And they understand the dynamics behind the cars. They understand the engineering part. They understand the PR department and what they need to do as far as ambassadors of the brand. So I think we have a very bright future ahead of us for American drivers with Porsche.
That's very pleasing to hear. Very, very pleasing to hear indeed. And just a last few questions for you, Hurley. One thing I've heard so much about from a distance about IMSA is the end of year banquet. There seems to be all kinds of crazy stories from that. Is there a particular funny story that you can remember from your days in IMSA, from the end of year banquets?
We're on public platform here, so yes. Can't tell you really.
Well, that tells you all you need to know about the stories.
We had some fun.
I can imagine. And at the moment, I see that you've got a 356 being restored at the moment. Tell us about that car and what the plan for it is.
I must say, you have really done your homework. Asked some good questions. Yeah, Rod Emery is building me a 356 Outlaw. He just sent me some pictures, so I just hope he's being truthful, but I think he does the first rolling test with the car, driving it at the end of this month. And then he's got a week in there where he's going to do, glamour shots, and then it'll be shipped to me. So I'm looking at somewhere on the first part of March, and it'll be shipped right to the collection. We'll do the delivery at the collection. And I'm really excited. I have always lusted after a 356, but I just could not justify spending that kind of money on a car that has that old technology. I'm a tech guy. I like stuff that's techy, and when I first started reading about Rod and what he was doing, I said, this is something I want to look at. And I went out to Lifticult, which is that program that Patrick does. Met Rod out there, saw a car that he had just finished building, a 356 Cabriolet, and I said, this is what I want. So my wallet is a lot lighter, but it's going to be, I think, some beautiful pieces. Lago green metallic. I told Wolfgang Porsche what I was doing, and he said, one of the things he said, what color are you going to do it in? And I said, Lago green metallic, and his eyes lit up. He says, that's going to be beautiful. So, yeah, I'm very excited about it.
I can imagine. And have you got what have you got planned for it when it arrives? Any road trips or anything like that, or what's the plan?
Well, is it? I'm not really quite sure. I think we'll do short trips and maybe drive to Atlanta, go up at the headquarters in Atlanta, and let everybody see it up there, and Ray Schaefer at the Porsche Classic part at the headquarters. But we still have to be careful. Everybody's being really strict with the COVID stuff, and I don't think we're going to be back at headquarters until maybe the second half of the year. So
it's time to prepare.
And hopefully I'll have the car. Hopefully it'll be here by the time. Well, it better be here. Amelia is the end of May this year, and so it got postponed. It was just coming up the first part of March, but Bill Warner moved it over to the end of May. So that will probably be its first public outing, where people will be able to see it.
I won't get a more grand scale than the Amelia Island concourse. Now, the last question about the car is, will the dogs be allowed in it? Because some people do, some people don't. Yeah,
the dogs, I've got 3 now, 3 dogs.
Okay, wow.
And a little puppy who is not quite, I'm not quite sure where she is, but she's not quite housebroken yet. But I have a special platform being built on the back seat, over the back seat, and with clips. So you're able to take a short leash, put them up on the panel, and then let them ride around. So they like that. They love sticking their heads out the window and having the air blow on them. So it'll be good.
What a life. What a life. Now, last question, Hurley, and this is something that we ask all of our guests. We call it the Racing Genie. And basically, it's like a kind of fantasy question, if you like. You can race in, you've probably done them already, but you can compete in any race, in any car, and with any co-driver. So what would your choices be for those 3 things if you were to create an ultimate combination of car, race, and co-driver?
Well, either the track I would choose would probably be Daytona.
Good choice.
And I would have loved to drive that prototype that they had a couple years ago.
The RS Spider.
The Spider, yeah.
Yeah. I'm writing a book about that at the moment.
Yeah, I think that would just be such a cool car to drive. And I would love, the one guy I have never driven with, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, is Patrick Long. So I would like to have Patrick Long as my co-driver. He's, young enough to do a majority of the work. I'll just sit back and enjoy the accolades. So, but yeah, Daytona in that car, I think would be sensational, and having, Patrick driving with me would be cool.
What a wonderful combination! Because of course Patrick raced with Penske in that particular car as well. I had a good chat with him a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me all about it, and what an extraordinary machine. But of course, it never raced at Daytona because of the split at the time. My brain's ticking here. So
I like open cars. I really like cars that are open. One of my favorite race cars, when people say, "What's your favorite race car?" It was a 936 or 956. That car to me was the perfect balance of aero and power. And it was just, I love that car, and it looked really sexy too.
It's a spectacular looking car. It was like the proper prototype spaceship at that time. Hurley, it has been an honor and a privilege to chat to you and talk about your incredible career. I know you'll get asked a lot of these things a lot, but it's just been such a joy. And thank you so much for coming to join us on the Porsche Sport Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The Porsche Sport Podcast, powered by Porsche Center Leeds. Test drive the new Porsche Taycan and experience soul electrified.